Hey there, friends and listeners. Just here with a quick disclaimer before the episode starts. At about 40 minutes in, we had a weird technical glitch that put an echo on about 50 minutes of the show. I tried to get rid of it, filled with it as much as I could, and I think I made it more listenable, but it's definitely still there. Sorry about that. Hope it's not too distracting, and enjoy the episode. Sometimes dead is better. Like us, the Pod Boys. I'm the stony soil of a man's heart, Matisse Van Rossum.
I'm the bus that hit Pascal, Ben Sheets.
I'm regretting my intro. Cleveland Mosier.
The cat man.
Ooh, let's not.
We back, and we're doing another original versus remake, and we're talking Pet Sematary today. Enough of the pussyfooting around. We're just gonna jump right on in.
Oh, I get it. Cats.
You found the joke.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Woo! Thanks. I'm honored.
So we're gonna start with the original Pet Sematary. Came out in 1989, directed by Mary Lambert, based on the 1985, I believe, novel by Stephen King. I might be slightly off on that year. It details the story of a man and his family who move to upstate Maine and discover that in the woods behind their house there is a pet cemetery, and further beyond, a mysterious power that brings the dead back to life.
Indian burial ground.
This is a Stephen King film adaptation, which sometimes are very bad, sometimes pretty good. In preparation for this episode, I did read the book, as I'm wont to do, a little over a month ago. The screenplay is by Stephen King.
And Stephen King was on set for the whole time with this, and he demanded that the script was followed very strictly.
And he even has a brief little cameo as a priest,
looking like a total dweeb.
I mean, Stephen King has always looked like a dweeb and still looks like a dweeb, but he writes some scary stuff. In terms of faithfulness to the novel, this film is pretty close. Like I would expect, considering that Stephen King adapted it himself. I don't think that all of the stuff from the book translates super well into film. I think that that's sort of a thing with Stephen King film adaptations. I think a lot of the time when the films are sort of found wanting in comparison to the book, it's because that he has a very particular style of writing that is very like inner monologue heavy and flow of consciousness.
And high concept.
I think
that's a big problem, yeah.
Well, one thing I was wondering about is how long is the book, roughly?
About 500 pages, I think. It's not super long.
That's still a lot to pack into one movie, you know?
Yeah. Stephen King is not a brief writer by any means.
No.
Most of his stuff is pretty long. And Pet Sematary is not as long as It, which is over 1,000 pages, but it's still a bit of a read. I do know that Pet Sematary is what Stephen King believes is the scariest book he's ever written, or at least the one that scared him the most. It hit him very close to home in a lot of ways, to the extent that when he wrote his first draft, he put it away in a desk drawer for several years and was like, I can't publish this. It's too spooky. And then he was under contract with his publisher, and he was changing publishers, and they're like, well, we still need one more book from you. You're still under contract for one more book. And he's like, okay, fuck it, whatever. And he got out Pet Sematary and released it. And the rest is history. It's one of his most famous novels.
Well, I think conceptually it's one of his scariest works, just because the ideas behind it are very real. In a way, sort of Lovecraftian, in that, like, it's, like, something beyond almost a mind virus at times in a way.
Well, yeah, Stephen King does that a lot. I know that one of his biggest problems with Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining is that Kubrick did not faithfully adapt that the hotel itself is the evil presence in the story. In, Kubrick's Shining, the hotel is just haunted, whereas in the novel, it is a sentient presence, the evil of the hotel. And in the same way that the Micmac burial ground in Pet Sematary is also a sort of sentient evil force, or more specifically, the Wendigo that resides there, which is something that this film does not really get into at all.
I'm kind of glad it doesn't, because I don't think it had the time to flesh that out.
I agree, but I also think that they did try to do certain things that they did in the book relating to the Wendigo that just fall really flat because they just feel thrown in and don't have any explanation. Like later in the film when he's going back to the Pet Sematary with his son's body, he hears like the ground shaking and like a roar and like that tree falls. Or like when he sees that weird face like materialize out of the darkness and then just disappear and it's never addressed at all.
That was weird. Yeah.
That's stuff that is much more fleshed out in the book and is an actual thing and is part of the Wendigo aspect that is just totally glossed over in the film. So I wish that if they were going to completely abandon that pretty large plot point, that they would have abandoned it completely rather than throwing in those weird little things that don't make any sense if you haven't read the book.
I think besides the face, which was kind of weird, it's very minor. And it's like, as someone who hadn't read the book before, I didn't think much of it.
I think because it keeps on at a quick enough pace that it doesn't leave you too much time to think about it.
Yeah.
But like I remember the first time I watched it before I read the book and I was just like, what the fuck is that? And then I immediately forget about it, but it does give me pause, especially the face.
Yeah. One of the things I really like about this version of the story, this adaptation, is how mundane the tone is a lot of times. It's not emphasizing its darkness too transparently. Like, the things that happen in it are very dark at times, but, like, it keeps, like, a pretty normal color palette, and, like, it goes for, like, a true to earth type of feel a lot of times.
I wonder how much of that was in Stephen King's script as well, because that's something that he does very well as a writer.
Oh, absolutely.
Is that he has evil and horror encroaching on very average, like mundane, like you said, situations and people. His characters are almost always heavily flawed. They feel really real. He does the inner monologue thing super well. I think in a lot of movies, they do not capture Stephen King's characters very well. I think Kubrick does a pretty good job in The Shining. We might as well get it out of the way that the acting in Pet Sematary is not great.
It is very bad.
I would say there are two performances that I think are legitimately good, and the rest is anywhere from subpar to just downright terrible.
Yes.
I think Fred Gwynne as Judd Crandall is great.
Yeah, he's
my favorite. Brad Greenquist, who plays Victor Pascal, is also really good.
He almost gave off like an Anthony Michael Hall vibe, and this movie came out in the late 80s too, but I think it's his weird get up with like the short shorts,
the jogging shorts. That's something that's very specifically drawn from the book. His red jogging shorts. We kept making comments about how bad Dale Midkiff is as Lewis Creed.
Man, it's
the protagonist.
It's awful.
I don't think it bothered me as much as it bothered y'all, but he's extremely flat. Yeah. He does not emote well at all, and I think that it works well for like after Gage is hit by the truck and he's supposed to be in like shock and grief. The flatness premise works really well. The problem is all of the lead up to that, he's also extremely flat and weird.
And kind of dark. Like, even then, like, he's got kind of like I'm a spooky dad, you know? And I was like,
a cardboard cutout performance. Yeah. Like, he did not emote at all. Like,
no arc. He's very flat.
It felt almost Garth Marenghi-esque in a weird amateurish way that didn't match the tone of the movie at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this movie is very hokey in a lot of ways, and I think that for people who are really fans of like Stephen King's writing might find that frustrating. At this point, I've just kind of come to accept it and try to enjoy it for what it is. The made-for-TV 1990 It film is the same way, that if you try to hold it up in comparison to the book, you're going to have a really bad time. But if you enjoy it for, like, the really bad acting and, like, the super schlocky, dumb set pieces, I think it can be fun.
Fantastic Tim Curry performance.
I do not think that Pet Sematary reaches those depths. I think it is a pretty solid film.
Well, yeah, and it has a lot going for it. You know, the concept is excellent. The effect work is really
pretty good.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I loved the practical and special effects in this movie. Primarily the practical effects.
Like
up until the final sequence. Like we'll get to that.
When they bring in Victor Pascal after he's been hit by the car. I really like that transition because it's like Lewis is going into his first day of work. You know, he's just started a job as like the head physician at like the University of Maine at like the clinic. So he's moved from Chicago to a much quieter existence, dealing with, sick college students and, probably some venereal diseases and stuff like that. And he's leaving for work and his wife says something like, not so much as a nosebleed today or something like that. And then it like smash cuts into like Victor Pascal's like crushed head and like his brain oozing blood and like throbbing.
And there's like 40 of his classmates like mobbed around, like
carrying him into the clinic. So I think that cut is really effective. And it's the first time we really get a taste of like violence in the film and like blood and gore, and I think that those effects still hold up really, really well.
Oh yeah, they hold up excellently, and I think the way that scene was played out was really excellent too. We'll get into it more when we talk about the new one, but I think it works better in this version.
That character is utilized much more effectively and much more true to the book. I think he's a very comparable character to the friend in American Werewolf in London, who gets mauled by the werewolf at the beginning, and he is sort of like this ghostly presence that's like haunting the protagonist, but is trying to help him. That's what Pascal is. He comes back as a ghost to Lewis and is like, you tried to help me, so I'm gonna try to help you. And he leads him out to the pet cemetery in the middle of the night and points at the deadfall, and he's like, the barrier isn't meant to be broken, the ground is sour, don't go beyond the barrier. Which is a great setup because that there's not gonna be a film if he doesn't go beyond the barrier.
Chekhov's barrier.
Right, exactly. Chekhov's deadfall. I think it's great, and to have Pascal be set up as like an early suggestion of the supernatural, which I think makes what happens in the rest of the film a lot more believable as well, because you already know that there's some supernatural force at work here.
And the thing I like about Pascal a lot in his representation in this movie is he's a scary looking character, but he doesn't see himself as a scary character. Really?
No, he's helping.
Yeah,
he's helping the characters.
And
he's not an antagonistic character at all.
I think that changes in the new one, which we'll get into a little bit more. I like that juxtaposition because, again, it makes it feel more mundane and not grimdark.
Yeah, no, I
it balances
agree.
it out really well. One of the other effects that I really liked in this movie quite a bit was the wife,
Denise Crosby.
Yeah, she used to have a sister who had spinal meningitis.
Yeah.
And they have a couple of flashback scenes with her going to feed her essentially dying sister.
Yeah.
And I found those scenes to be horrifying.
I think those are some of the
really.
I think those are some of the creepiest in the movie.
I think that the idea of them was, and okay, so I felt they became creepier. I think the first sequence with it, I think it ended, and I kind of felt so along the lines. It felt like very haunted housey, overly dramatized, almost like the way the sister sort of has like that heavy makeup and is acting very spooky.
Well,
like,
I think
there's like the music is very spooky, and like she goes into the room. But as a sequence progresses, and when we learn the backstory behind it, and we reveal how the sister dies, that changed for me. But I feel like that opening sequence was
I didn't really
haunted house-like.
feel like it was too overly haunted house. Like, she looks gaunt and jaundiced, but she's not like...
It's also from... I think it's also fine for me because it's from the perspective of a child.
Yes.
It's a flashback from the perspective of a child, of her as like an 8-year-old being left alone in the house with her dying sister, who has sort of been like shoved into a back bedroom and sort of forgotten about because the family doesn't want to like acknowledge that horrible reality. So, she's having to go and feed her twisted, bitter, dying sister, who is also, a young person. In the book, she is also a child. In both films, they age her up a little bit. But I think that having it being retold from the perspective of like an 8-year-old girl, I don't have a problem with it being dramatized and like extra spooky, because it would make sense that the mind of a child would warp this thing that's already, pretty horrible in the stark, light of day into something that is, even more exaggeratedly scary.
I think it's a solid justification.
I do think that both of the films are a little bit light on the development of Zelda and Rachel's relationship with her, because the book really gets into the nitty-gritty of that stuff, like how bitter towards Rachel Zelda is because Rachel is healthy, and how it got to the point that she was like purposely pissing and shitting her bed so that they would have to like clean it up, and that she was like, as she, as the disease progressed and she was getting closer and closer to death, she really started to behave more like a monster too. And because of having to deal with that at an early age, that Rachel is like very traumatized by the idea of death. It's why she doesn't want to talk about death. It's why she doesn't like it when young Ellie is asking Lewis about death and like, why do animals die sooner and stuff, and that he's a doctor, so he's giving her a very straightforward, unbiased scientific approach, like what life and death is, and that's why that bothers Rachel so much. And I don't think either of the films really get into that as much as they should. It just kind of makes her seem more like a nagging bitch of a wife. Like, why are you telling our daughter about death? Bah, bah, bah. And I think it's kind of a bad look.
I felt like it came out better in the modern one.
Really, I feel the opposite.
I feel that way because the monologue over the top of those scenes as well in the 80s version, I also felt was very deadpan. And I didn't get much like emotion or
bad
anything out of
acting.
it.
Like, comes down to bad acting.
Dampened it. These scenes are supposed to be painted by her recounting of it,
right?
And that's spoken over the top of all of it. And when it's delivered flatly, it frames it so poorly. Whereas I felt in the new one, once or twice I've spoken with people who've recounted something like traumatic, that's affected them like deeply or recently, and you get those same ticks and like trembles and pauses in those places, and it felt very genuine to me and well acted.
It was definitely better acted in the new one. I did feel like it was a little over the top in comparison, but we'll get into that further.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that when we get to the new one, but let's focus on the original.
The thing I really love about the effects of Zelda is how almost uncanny valley it feels at a certain point. Like she looks so close to human.
Yeah.
Yet it's like she's gaunt and jaundiced, and like it feels wrong.
Her
when you
makeup
look at her.
like
it's
has like
excellent.
a weird like stretched lipped sort of
Yeah,
quality.
Yeah,
And
no, I thought that was
I thought it was great.
I thought that was good too, and like the makeup effects like on her back as well.
Oh, it's awesome, yeah.
And they that carried over very well into the new one as well. But like I think it's obviously not to paint like any sort of terminal illness as like turning people into monsters, but in this case it's thematically relevant that Rachel perceives her dead sister as a monster, and I think that she looks very much like that, and to have her be sort of, as the film progresses, more and more haunted by Zelda as well, as sort of like a ghostly antagonistic presence, even though there's not literally a ghost of Zelda, but it's also sort of like the evil of the burial ground and the Wendigo, just kind of like seeping into everything. It's bringing up that past trauma. I think it's great, and I agree with you, Ben. I think that is some of the stuff with Zelda is some of the more horrifying stuff in the movie, and I think that has aged to continue to be more horrifying, because some of the stuff, and we'll get into the very end, but that shit is corny as fuck. It is so hokey.
Yeah, I think it translates really well, and it's really excellently done, and somehow it surpasses the bad acting to just stay good to this day, which is great.
I think so.
Like, especially like the discovery sequence. And another thing I did like about it was the husband's response after her recounting, where like of her discovering her sister dead, and her feeling sort of responsible for it, is him saying the absolute thing that was going through my mind, which was like, no, you were an 8-year-old child.
Like why did they leave you alone with your dying sister?
Which is also like cool, like backstory for the parents and why we shouldn't like them. Like,
yeah, dude, the parents suck.
Yeah, we get even further in.
At Gage's funeral, when Rachel's dad straight up blames Lewis for Gage's death
and beats him up
and starts like punching and kicking him
in front of everyone
and knocks the like casket off and almost opens it. And then how somebody comes up to Lewis and is like, get a hold of yourself. It's like,
what's
bitch,
wrong with you?
Yeah, like, what's wrong with you? Get a hold of yourself, bitch. My father-in-law just attacked me and blamed me for the death of my son at his funeral and knocked my son's coffin onto the floor.
He gets up
and
from
I'm
the ground.
one who needs to get a hold of myself.
It makes literally no sense in the sequence. Like the father-in-law like walks up to him, starts screaming at him, and then like beats him a couple of times, and then like falls back and knocks over the thing.
Yeah.
And then the husband falls over, and like someone is picking him up when the guy walks up to the husband and is like, what are you doing? And it's like, he was standing there. He did literally nothing.
Yeah.
I don't understand that at all. Like, what was that in the movie?
He is not in the wrong in that situation at all.
I was very confused.
Well, I think we should maybe use that as a segue into talking about how Pet Sematary is a film that does not shy away from child death.
No.
Which I think a lot of things are scared to do. And I think that's part of the reason why Stephen King considered it like his scariest work. As he lays out in the foreword to the book that I was reading, he and his wife moved with their like young daughter and infant son to like a country house in Maine while he was working like teaching at the university, and that it was a route for like trucks from a chemical company that would just blaze down the road way too fucking fast, and that his daughter's cat got killed, and that he always thought like, shit, if I don't keep an eye on like my infant son, like he could toddle out into the road and get fucking smoked by a truck. And like that is what Pet Sematary is. Like that is the central plot.
And I mean, even if you remove all of the supernatural elements from that film, just the very the idea of burying your child in a pet cemetery is wretched. Like is a wretched idea that is all the fucking chills.
Yeah,
incredibly terrifying and hard to watch.
Yeah, especially like I mean the kid is really cute too, and we get so much stuff of, you know, like the kid being adorable, and even the scene like when he dies, like right before when he's flying the kite, you know, and it's like super heartwarming and cute, and then they turn their back for a second and he runs out into the road like right as this big fucking 18-wheeler is blazing down the highway, you know, just fucking flattens him.
I like how it feels almost random too.
Yeah.
Like there's no inciting thing that makes him really run into the road besides, you know, dropping the kite.
Yeah, the kite is blowing away and he's sort of following it into the road.
Yeah. I like how mundane that feels. You know, it really makes it feel less sinister and more like of a shock when it happens, I think.
Yeah.
Which I think is excellent. I think both of the kids do a really solid job in terms of acting. Child actors tend to ham it up and overact. The daughter
doesn't do a whole lot for me. The little boy is pretty good, but I think it's just because he's naturally cute. There's not much in terms of acting. Like some of the stuff when he comes back from the dead at the end and becomes a little monster is kind of fucking corny, but it's also like
kinda.
How do you turn such like a cute angelic little boy into a demon essentially?
Well, I mean, I think the scene where he kills the neighbor.
Oh, when he kills Judd,
yeah, is pretty excellent.
I agree.
You know, I think him taking the scalpel, being hidden under the bed, and the effects on that are really great too. I thought the scalpel cuts.
Oh, into the tendon?
Yeah, cutting his mouth? Achilles tendon.
Oh, yeah. Those were very well done. The gore effects in this movie are great across
really
the
great.
board.
And the aftermath shot we get of Judd after the fact
after he's been eaten a little bit,
see, his teeth and jaw just split open.
Man, one of the things that I do wish that both movies addressed a little bit better, and the remake does it somewhat. In the book, essentially anything that's buried in the Micmac burial ground is like possessed by the Wendigo is essentially what it's supposed to be. So in the book, when the kid comes back and he goes and like interacts with Judd, he's like talking and saying like really vile shit like your wife is getting ass fucked in hell and shit like that. And I mean, obviously I understand how they couldn't have a child saying that in the new movie, but I think that in the book, like that's what such a great image is, like this, you know, this little boy just like speaking with the voice of a monster, you know, just saying like really horrible, vile shit. I wish that there was a little bit more of that. I think it would have made that a little bit more visceral.
I don't know, man. I kind of like how when they were brought back in this movie, they almost feel like lifeless and zombie-esque in a lot of ways.
It didn't do anything for me.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. I think in this one there's a little bit too much of like disembodied like child's laughter such
that
like
is weird.
Just such like a horror movie trope of like the perversion of innocence, you know, the creepy kid thing, and I think that
it's a zombie.
Yeah, like I think that some of that is a little bit too goofy with like the disembodied child laughter and the like.
It was taking me straight up out of it. Like the film had really grabbed me with like the sequence after Gabe had died, and like I was so struck and terrified by like this concept of like this small like innocent child coming back and being this like horrible monster is like it's quite spooky, and I was there for it and I was ready is all I'm saying. And the film took that away from me, and that feeling of fear when we started getting the canned children's laughter and sort of the hokier elements. And I think it kind of dropped the hammer on its foot.
At the end of the confrontation at the end where Lewis injects like a fatal dose of morphine into the kid, and the first thing out of his mouth is "no fair." Like it's funny. It made me laugh, and like in the context of like the hokiness of the film, I think that's really great. But it's like it takes the spookiness out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that what makes the concept horrifying is that a parent is willing to exhume the corpse of their child, bury it in a wretched place, and it come back as the vessel for like something ancient and evil and cruel.
Well,
I think that's what makes it spooky about the concept.
Absolutely.
And to just have it be like like an evil little kid, but still be a child, I think it makes it less interesting and less scary. It's fun. It's definitely more fun. Like that scene where they're fighting, and it's obviously just like a grown man pretending to wrestle with a doll. It's fucking hilarious. There
is a bit where like it comes out of the attic and they literally just throw, like, someone off camera throws a doll at him.
It's really funny. It's bad. It's really funny. But if you're going into this movie looking for scary and not funny, then it doesn't work at all. It doesn't work at all.
It's such a weighty concept, like, and to make me laugh at that, like, pretty insufferable execution. Cut that.
At that point, there's been enough hokiness that like I'm willing to drop the serious pretensions of this movie and just enjoy the schlockiness. But I agree with you that trying to take it from a serious perspective, it doesn't work.
Especially when we can see how in the previous sequence when it kills Judd, like, it can be done.
No, I think that sequence is done really well. I do think it's very cool what they did in this movie when Lewis comes over to the house after Judd and Rachel have been killed, and he walks in and the house is like all overgrown with like moss and branches and leaves and stuff. So great. it's like the woods have like invaded the house, like the power of the woods have invaded the house. I thought that was a very cool touch. And that's something that's not in the book. Like, I just thought that was really excellent visually.
It was subtle too. It wasn't too over the top.
Yeah, the like the psychedelia or like the dream-like sequences, the sort of like playing at reality is interesting to look at in both movies, for sure. That was one aspect of it I did very much like. Honestly, I loved the set dressing across the board. I thought like the circular pet cemetery and stuff.
Yeah.
It was all very artificial. It was all very dressed, but it was dressed well. It was, it was well crafted.
Frankly, I think that stuff is dressed better in this film than in the remake.
Oh, I agree.
And we won't get too heavily into that right now, but I do think that in this film, the Pet Sematary and the Micmac Burial Ground both look great. I think the Micmac Burial Ground is cool too, especially we get those aerial shots of like the stone rings with like all of the cairns and stuff. It looks ritualistic. It looks sort of occult a little bit.
Yeah, we don't get that overhead shot in the new one. Yeah. And I agree.
I think that stuff is great. I do think what is weird is that like a lot of the stuff in this movie just like happens in the daytime, which in the book it all happens at night. Like when they first go out to the Micmac Burial Ground to bury the cat when it first dies, that's just in the daytime. When he goes to the fucking graveyard to dig up his son, that's just in the daytime.
I love that all of that is set in the daytime.
I thought that was so weird.
I love that because, like I said, it feels more mundane because of that. If it was all set at night, it'd be dark and spooky. But like
maybe for burying the cat, I think it's okay. But in the book, part of like the trip out to the Micmac Burial Ground, which feels a lot longer in the book because it's like 3 or 4 miles away from the house. So they're just like trudging through the woods and at night. And, you know, there's a lot of like psychological stuff going on in the movie. Like, okay, saying that during the day is fine. But like when he goes to the graveyard with like a shovel and like a spade to dig up the body of his son in the daytime, that feels weird, because where like there would be people, like people could see him doing this, and there's something.
At one point the cops drive by,
right?
Remember?
And there's something that I think is extremely raw about like having to steal away into a cemetery in the dark of night to exhume the body of your like 3-year-old son, because you're gonna take him out to the woods and bury him in a cursed Indian burial ground.
Right. Well, it's
like,
it's sort of a Frankenstein reversal.
Right. Exactly.
Right? Like the stereotype of like a grave robber is like, oh, the bad person is going in to, you know, to rob graves in the middle of the night, and finding a good person like forced into that position is fascinating. And I think that it being at night like helps sort of emphasize that.
The fact that he's so broken that he doesn't even feel like he can wait until the nighttime is what does it for me, I think.
I would agree if it wasn't for the fact that like people would be walking around in the daytime. Like world building wise, like what would have stopped him from getting caught? Like just like,
I mean, he almost does. He doesn't care though. You know, the cops drive by. You know,
I think one of the great things in the book, though, is him the day before, like leading up to him going to rob the grave, and him like having to continually convince himself that he's doing the right thing, you know, having been warned by Judd, sometimes dead is better, you know, and that whole monologue, and to be like, Judd told me about a time that burying a person there went wrong and bad, but like, you know, maybe it'll be different this time, and him going to like a motel and like spending the day there, just like waiting for night to fall and being like, am I doing the right thing? Yeah, I am. Am I doing the right thing? Maybe not. But yeah, I am. Like, I think that is what would have been nicer to see rather than him just going to the graveyard in the daytime. But I mean, that's, you know, that's something that I'm getting from having access to the source material beforehand. Yeah. So it's like, it's not necessarily like a fair critique. What I do want to talk about is the ending, because I think that it's so thematically strong.
Yes.
That when he, you know, finally puts down Gage and, you know, burns down Judd's house, he still takes Rachel's body and takes her out to the cemetery to bury her, and he rationalizes it by
she's still fresh.
She just died. If I bury her, she'll come back okay. And it's like that he's seen with the cat and then with Gage, and like he has seen that this is wrong, but he's still so overcome with grief and being acted on by this all-powerful evil force that it still draws him back out there to do it. And we still see him at the very end, you know, sitting at home waiting for Rachel to come back. And when she does, and her face is just ruined, and she's leaking pus from like what remains of her eye, and that they still embrace, and that he still kisses her. And then it ends with her picking the knife up off the table and then, you know, cutting to black right before she stabs him. Like, I think that thematically, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's a great way to end the film.
I think it's excellent.
I'm glad you said thematically, too, because the biggest problem was, I found, the acting and the portrayal in that scene. Like, I didn't get that justification from his demeanor, only from his lines that he was delivering. So I didn't feel like he was like drawn back to that place. He's just saying like, oh, you know, like she's fresh, she's still going on, which like when he's saying it as like almost as flatly as he is, and like he's not Like, there's just not as much like physical remorse that I'm getting like from his composure, like, because he's just an actor on the set. You still want to think he's trying to apply logic because he looks like a person who's still being logical. You don't get the sense that he's being bound. I didn't get the sense that he was being bound by some sort of mystic force.
His logic is just being twisted on itself.
He's trying to apply logic to it, but
like they say earlier in the movie, but the burial ground infects people with.
That's what I'm saying. And like this is like the psychic, like the dark psychic fuel is like pulling him in towards it, and I don't get that like from his acting and like
from his performance. No,
it just gets him like poorly rationalizing.
He's a trash actor,
and it not being the it's just him poorly rationalizing this decision instead of it being him being pulled there because of this.
See, I don't know if I agree with that part of it because I think his actions speak a lot. His line delivery is trash because he's like we said, he's a garbage actor.
Like his dialogue even says it. Like that's fine. It's just his delivery of it doesn't sell it, and that really hurts it for me.
Yeah. I guess. I feel like for me, the action of that happening in the movie says most of what needs to be said on its own.
Yeah, I think so, especially considering how when Judd comes to him earlier in the movie and is like, I feel like I'm responsible for the death of your son because I brought you to the burial ground in the first place, and that once you've been there, you try to find any reason to go back, that it's sort of drawing you in once you've been there. Like, his actions at the end speak that, because he's clearly just seen that bringing his son back didn't work the way he wanted and resulted in the death of his friend and his wife, but that he's still convinced that if he takes his wife there, that things will be different. Like, it's totally bogus logic, but it makes sense from a grief perspective, and also that he's being acted on by an evil force that is literally calling him back to it over and over again, Yeah.
And that worked super well for me. I think that works. It conveyed itself pretty well.
I also did have a problem with, I like Pascal as an actor. Like I've said, his charisma was solid, and like the idea of him like sort of just being there and like him trying to make his presence more known. I didn't necessarily like the cinematography around his character, like
him disappearing and stuff. Like, is that what you didn't?
Yeah, it was fairly like hokey, and it because it's a very high concept thing, like this dead person like hanging out and just trying to make himself known in their reality. And when he's saying lines, he's saying things that only the viewer can hear, and it just like it would take me out of the film. Like he almost like it almost feels like he's breaking the fourth wall because he's saying those things only for himself to hear. And
he's acting upon the characters subconsciously. They don't necessarily see him. We hear what he's trying to say to them, but it does.
But like as spoken almost to us, like it was.
Honestly, it worked. For me.
I don't have a problem with that either, because we're obviously the viewer seeing what he's trying to get across, but we also see that the people he's addressing don't see him directly, but that he's acting upon their intuition and their subconscious.
And he affects their actions throughout, It's
right.
not like he's...
But in such a way that it seems like it's decisions they come to themselves, rather than him just appearing as a ghost and telling them directly, do this,
Right, which I would have hated. Like,
right.
It's the cinematography and just the application of it that I have a problem with. Like, it's the flatness of it. It's that he's just sort of like in the shots and like interacting with the characters in the scenes as an actor.
Oh, I think that's fun. I like that.
Yeah, I thought it was fine.
It was strange for me. Yeah, it took me out a little bit.
Question for you, T, since you read the book.
Yeah.
Judd's wife hangs herself in this movie.
No. That is the that's not Judd's wife.
That was his neighbor. She lives in a different house.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
yeah,
it's a separate neighbor.
Like
why was that a thing? Did they explain that more in the book?
That doesn't happen in the book. That was something that doesn't work for me either.
That was baffling for me because it didn't have any rhyme or reason. Really.
Well, see, okay, so in the book, Judd's wife is alive for part of it.
Really?
She's not dead. Part of Ellie's first exposure to like the death of a person is when Judd's wife has a heart attack.
Oh, shit.
So they needed to have that in the movie, but they didn't actually have Judd's wife be a character. So they just had the maid who's there doing their laundry hang herself because she had cancer. I agree. It doesn't make any sense in the context of the film.
It would have worked better if it was Judd's wife, but at the same time, it also, because I thought she was Judd's wife, because they're always in the scenes like near each other or together, almost always when we see
I don't think they're in any
scenes
scenes together.
I don't think is there even a scene with them together?
She only just shows up to like do laundry and stuff. When are she and Judd in a scene together?
We see her in the house when they're eating together. There's no payoff to that stuff.
No, I agree.
It just feels so bizarre in the movie.
It feels shoehorned in. In the book, Judd's wife is supposed to be like, the family is, being continually exposed to death, Lewis has to explain to Ellie like the concept of death, and like her cat dies and he, brings the cat back, in order that she doesn't have to learn that truth, and Judd's wife dies so like Ellie can be exposed to, the concept of death and what death means. And in this movie, having the maid just hang herself like that, it's a total throwaway thing. I agree with you.
It doesn't have the same punch to it.
It doesn't work at all. It doesn't work at all.
I do want to talk about the cat though, just for a second. The cat,
very cute cat,
very cute throughout, even as an evil cat.
I know, even when it comes back as a zombie, I can't take it seriously because it's like such a cute cat.
Additionally, like the effect for the evil cat where they just like paint on the film yellow eyes.
I loved it.
It's goofy, and it didn't really. It felt the most dated out of any of the effects in the movie. I didn't hate it because it was hokey and kind of fun, but it did kind of throw me off.
That effect didn't bother me at all because it just looked to me like that they shined a light on the cat's eyes to make it reflective and maybe brightened that a little bit with like an After Effects glow or something. And I mean, After Effects is like an effect after the fact, not obviously
After Effects.
Obviously not. But that didn't bother me too much. I just thought that like even when the cat comes back, it's like fur is matted a little bit, but it doesn't look like a evil spooky cute cat. It's still an extremely cute cat. I mean, I'm somewhat biased because I'm such a cat daddy. Like I love cats so much that I just think all cats are cute. But yeah, the cat is goofy, but in a fun way. Like I like the zombie cat. I think it's fun.
It's definitely not scary by any means. But
No.
It's
well,
fun.
I would honestly, for me, I would say very little in this film is actually scary. I think the stuff with Zelda is the closest.
Yeah, I think that's the scariest.
That's the
part of the
scariest
movie,
stuff.
in my
Yeah,
opinion.
because I think it's one of the least. It's extremely dramatized, but I think it's one of the least hokey things in the movie. So I think that's maybe why it works the best for me as a scary thing. But like, ultimately, I don't find this film particularly frightening. And I think part of that is age. I think that it might have been considered scarier when it came out, and that just some of that stuff hasn't aged super well. I think that despite being narratively quite true to the book, that it doesn't capture the tone of the book as well as I would like. But
it captures the themes very well, which I'll give it props for.
Yeah,
like,
to an extent, I would agree.
Like the idea of it infecting people through grief and stuff like that is very excellently done. And, the ideas of
if I would have seen like grief acted better, I would agree.
Yeah, I think
I don't.
I think that would.
That's
a short,
generally
yes.
Yeah.
I do think like we didn't talk much about his character in this movie, but I do want to reiterate that I think Fred Gwynne does a really good job as Judd Crandall.
Yeah, I really like Judd in that movie.
He's a great character.
That was better.
He's got that old Maine accent. You don't want to be. You want to be careful of that road, Lewis. You don't want your kids playing in that road. Run. The soil of a man's heart is stonier, Lewis.
Dude, you almost went a little Bane there.
Yeah, no, I think he's really better. You merely adopted the Pet Sematary. I was born in it. Yeah, no, I think he's great. For me, he's the standout performance in the film.
Yeah,
I think he's a really excellent Judd Crandall. And when I was reading the book, like, even though it had been a couple of years since I seen the movie, like, I just imagined him as that character. I think he embodies the character so well. So shout outs and RIP. But do y'all want to rate this and move into the next one?
Yeah. I guess I'll start. I think this movie has a great concept behind it. The effects are great, and a lot of it works for me. It's a little hokey today, but I think the biggest shortcoming is the acting in it, like we've emphasized.
Yeah.
It's just laughably bad. But a lot of the themes and ideas they're presenting are excellent and pretty solidly executed, I would say. So I would give this movie a 3.5. It's worth checking out. It's not a perfect adaptation, it's not a perfect Stephen King movie by any means, but it's a fun movie, and I think it does a pretty solid job.
Yeah, I can pretty much echo that almost exactly. Like, I think that if you put your bias towards spookiness aside and you just go into it like willing to appreciate the hokiness and the fun, I think you'll have a good time. I think it's a solid film. The acting is by far the biggest downside. Like, outside of Judd Crandall and Victor Pascal, like across the board, the acting is pretty trash, which is unfortunate, but I think it's a pretty decently solid adaptation of the book. It doesn't quite capture the same tone, but it does a good job addressing the themes and, giving almost the exact same narrative of the book. It does a good job at that. I'm also going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. I think that's just about right.
Killer effects. I love the effects. I love the set dressing. And again, like, as we've all iterated and reiterated, the high concept stuff is great. Like, the plot is great. The dialogue is fantastic as well. But unfortunately, like, it is a character-driven story, and the character acting is bad. And so that hit pretty hard for me. And of course, the final fight sequence with the doll, like with the dad, like and just those doll shots, like the fact that those made it into the final cut are ridiculous to me, and didn't do well for me at all. I'm gonna say, considering the pluses, the minuses, the execution I think is what's the most important, and that's a 3. That's a 3 for me.
All right, that'll give Pet Sematary 1989 an average of 3.3 out of 5 pods. Before we move on to the remake, it's time for a quick word from our sponsor.
So the sponsor tonight is brought to you by Schrodongel's Cat Box. Having trouble with your cat coming back? And it's all undead and shit? Well, don't worry anymore. Put that fucker in Schrodongel's Cat Box. Now it's not dead, and also it's dead. And that's alright! Schrodongel's Cat Box, or Schrodiblets, or whatever I called it. That thing. Go get it! It's great for stuff.
Sometimes dead is or isn't better. All right, so now we're going to be talking about the brand new Pet Sematary that just came out, directed by Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer, who are essentially nobodies from what I can tell. They directed a sequel to Mama, which I didn't even know existed, and some other things that I've never heard of. So what did you guys think of Pet Sematary 2019?
Man, I have some mixed feelings about this movie.
I do too.
I loved it.
Interesting.
I thought it was fucking great front and back.
I
have very few complaints about this movie, so I'm just gonna let you guys talk for a little bit.
I was really excited about the movie based on the trailer. I thought it looked like a pretty solid remake, and it had some actors that I liked in it, like Jason Clarke as Louis Creed and John Lithgow as Judd Crandall.
Who I will say does an excellent job.
Yeah, he does a really good job. I think I still prefer Fred Gwynne, but I think that John Lithgow does a great job. And overall, I would say that I was pretty on board with most of this movie. I think that it lost me in a few very key ways, mostly in the third act, but I thought that the first 2 acts of the film were pretty solid. It's much less of a direct adaptation of the novel.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest problem I had. It felt like they were making a remake of the original movie more than they were trying to adapt the story.
Well, yeah, I kind of felt the same way, especially because there were a couple of instances where they directly referenced parts from the original movie and then like subverted the expectation in a way that where it's like you seen the original, you know what's gonna happen here, psych.
There's several sequences of the movie where it made me appreciate the care that was taken in the original a little bit more. For example, the Pascal scene.
Yeah.
When Pascal shows up at the clinic is very horrifying in this version of the movie, but it isn't given enough time to gestate, and on top of that, the Pascal character feels like he's trying to be sinister, or he sees himself as sinister.
Almost feels like an afterthought. Like he has much less of a direct effect on things that are happening in the film, unlike the Pascal in the original. And that I thought was kind of unfortunate because I like the character of Pascal in the original. I like him as sort of this like creepy yet benevolent ghost. And in this, it felt more like he just showed up a couple of times
to be spooky
and be like, the ground is sour, and like that was the extent of his contribution. And in the grand scheme of things, like by the end of the movie, I was sort of questioning why they included the character at all in the film if they weren't going to give him the same importance that both the book and the original film give his character.
See, that's interesting. I really liked it. I really liked Pascal. First off, another thing I didn't like about the first one, the introductory scene with Pascal in the new one is a little bit longer. There's a little bit more time to sit in the scene. Like he dies on the table and the dad's like sitting there and he's thinking for a little bit. Whereas in the original, like he's wheeled in, the people leave the room and he immediately like grabs his hand, sits up, and like they have a full fucking conversation. And in this one, it's a little bit more cerebral. It's a little bit more like distant. And this was a distance and that carries out, as you were saying, throughout the rest. Like Pascal's character is much less in the room and like a relatable guy with a massive head wound, and he's more a spectral force who is trying to communicate something to them from across the gap and is struggling to, and that I found to be more effective.
He felt like an actual soul in the first one, where like with this one it never connected, and I actually don't think they were given as much time in the new one as they were in the original. And maybe that's just because of the conversation they have after the fact, which I personally like quite a bit because I think it makes it feel more like a connective thing rather than such a disparate element.
Yeah, I think that in the original it feels like there's a tug of war between like two supernatural forces, between like the evil and Pascal, you know, and the evil is clearly much stronger, but that like Pascal is like a benevolent helping force that is trying to, you know, save Louis and his family from the evil. And I don't feel that that is the case in the new one, and I think that that's somewhat to its detriment, because what I think is great about both the book and the original is that the Pascal Spectre tries so hard, it feels so earnest, but he fails ultimately because he's not quite, you know, he's not able to bridge the gap quite enough to be direct, you know? And in this one, it just feels like he shows up a couple of times to repeat either the barrier is not meant to be broken or the ground is sour.
Honestly,
like that's basically all he says.
He feels more like an extension of the spooky woods.
A little bit.
Rather than, you know, someone that's trying to help, you know, keep them.
And what I like in the original too, which is also something they did in the book, is that right before he dies, or when he comes back right after he has died, he says to Louis, "The soil of a man's heart is stonier." That's the first time Louis hears that, and that's why when Judd says that to him later in the movie, it gives Louis pause, because Pascal has said that to him. And that's not in this movie. Pascal does not have that line. Judd does, John Lithgow does later in the movie, but I think that it's less poignant, you know, to just have Judd say that rather than to have Pascal say it, and then for it to be, when Judd says it later, for that to be a callback, you know, and for that to be like a moment where Louis feels like, you know, there's really some outside force at work.
So the new film does the same, but with a different line. And I don't. This is one of the situations where I'm fairly neutral. I'm neither here nor there on which I like better. I think there can be arguments made for both. In the new adaptation, he just says the ground is sour here, and that's the line that gives Louis pause when he's talking to Judd. So they still have that, but they use the different line. They use that the ground is sour, which I personally like, because that the reason I like that is because it's a little bit more direct. It's something that the spirit would try to tell you, is like, look, the ground is really bad here. Like, bad things are gonna happen if you keep fucking with this place. Like, the ground is sour. Whereas like in the first adaptation, like the motive is a little weird. Like, he's trying to tell him like this very clear thing: the ground is bad, and he's being cryptic about it. Why is he saying the soil of a man's heart is stonier when he could say the ground bad? Like, and in this movie he does. Now that being said, the soil of a man's heart is stonier is beautiful. That's a really cool statement, and it is very fascinating, and its ambiguity is part of the horror of it, which is the argument for that.
And it's prophetic too.
Yes.
Which I think is what gives it its power in the context of the narrative, is that, you know, when Louis experiences that, he doesn't know what it means, and he's, you know, he doesn't understand like what happened to Pascal and how Pascal knows his name, and, you know, that's something that he has to ruminate on. Whereas like the ground is sour, the barrier isn't meant to be broken, you know, is, I think, a little bit more, it's a little bit more literal, and it's less,
it's blunt, and in kind of the main element that I have a problem with of the movie, it's way too literal, and it misses the themes of the movie. You know, like, it feels like you're just straight up hitting a needle with a hammer.
Yeah,
you know?
I agree, because I think the line about the soil of a man's heart is much more thematically relevant than the literal interpretation of like the ground is bad, the ground is sour, and don't break the barrier. That's not what it's really about. It's about like, what is a man willing to do, you know, from his grief. You know, the soil of a man's heart is stonier. He grows what he can and he tends it, you know? Like that is so thematically relevant to Lewis's character. Like that's why it's a line from the book. That's why that line gets the focus that it does in the film adaptations. You know, I think that it's thematically so much more powerful than the literal. I think we get plenty of the literal. I think that's just not the place for it.
And the thing is, like, I feel like this remake captures a lot of the elements of what the story does, but not the ideas behind them. In that, especially in the third act, which we'll get into much more in depth in a little bit. But I think, for example, where the original and the book is about, you know, being able to bring something back from the dead only to have to kill it with your own hands. That idea of getting something back only to have to directly be the cause of its demise is so much more horrifying, and that is not in this movie, really.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I agree.
I felt, I mean, with the father, like, literally taking that into his own hands, like, when he's choking her out, like, I thought that was, like...
Oh, I mean, only to be undone by zombie family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't... It doesn't have a payoff. Yeah, I agree with you, Ben. I think that... Yeah, that is what it's about, to be driven to do something so repulsive and vile and wrong, but because you're so grief-stricken, you feel like it's the only thing you have to do, and you have to then deal with it. You know, the soil of a man's heart is stonier. He grows what he can and he tends it. You know, you reap what you sow. You have sown this evil and it has come back and bitten you horribly in the ass, and you have to do something about it. But even after you have dealt with it, you're still drawn to make the exact same mistake over again. That's what I think that the book and the first film do so well, that is just totally undone by this film.
And because it's missing, it goes from this, you know, high concept, very cerebral horror idea and just becomes a haunted burial ground, you know, insidious standard fare kind of thing by the end of the third act.
It turns into like a standard modern horror film.
It becomes just boring. It misses the heart of the ideas they're going at, and because of that, it just feels like a boring, passable movie. And the other thing I'll mention about that is the reason I brought up the original feeling so mundane is I feel like this one overemphasizes the darkness of its setting and all of that to such an extent that it feels over the top and ultimately flat to me.
That's, yeah, very interesting, because again, like, I felt like, again, like, the ground is sour here is a much more mundane way to, you know, to approach that. I would think than to get all ponderous and, ooh, soil of a man's heart, whereas, you know, if you're just trying to, like, reach out to someone and say that directly, you would say that.
I mean, that scene happens in a stormy, evil, dark forest, the dead of night, and all of the main scenes happen in these dark settings, and like,
I mean, that doesn't bother me quite so much.
It makes it feel more cohesive, but it feels more flat because of it.
That doesn't bother
feel
me.
Like the real world.
That doesn't bother me too much. Well, okay, because it's not because it's the evil of not the real world encroaching on the real world. So
but to have that, you have to have an element of the real world, which I don't feel like it had nearly as much, because it was resting on the laurels of that dark tone. You know, we got to emphasize we're a horror movie in every shot.
I felt like the characters, like, in the family and stuff, they brought, like, a great sense of, like, reality to it. The way that they approached those scenarios, the way they reacted to that evil dark was something that I felt real people, were in ways I felt real people would react to them.
For most of the film, I agree with you. I think we can definitely say that the acting in this film is much stronger.
It is absolutely
and because of that, the characters feel more like real people than in the original. And I think that's what carried it for me a lot of the way. Like I think there are a few too many jump scares in this movie. I think that there are a few too many times in the early film where it feels the necessity to get overly grim dark. I agree with that, but I don't have a problem with the ultimately darker tone because I feel like it captures the tone of the book a little better. Mm-hmm. But I do think it could maybe use a few more moments of lightness.
It needs that dynamic element. Exactly. It can't just be dark.
It can't just be. I think that the beginning there's a good amount of lightness, but it goes away relatively quickly.
But even then, you have the spooky kids in masks that never mentioned again, but it's just so you can have some spooky imagery,
Yeah, like I said earlier, like that made sense, like in the setting, like that fits in that environment, and it built the town up a little bit more, and it gave us a little bit more to see, behind the way the area has been affected by this.
It undermines the lightness of the early parts of the movie, though, for me, because it's like, ooh, these are some spooky kids,
From a visual perspective, it's good spookiness. I think what the problem that I have is that the Pet Sematary itself is not the evil. The evil is beyond. The Pet Sematary is supposed to be a place where, kids bury their beloved pets, and that, the place where the dead rest, whereas beyond the deadfall is the place where the dead walk. So, I think that the original film does a little bit better of a job as making the Pet Sematary itself a little bit less spooky. It's about what's beyond the Pet Sematary, And I do think that a little bit of that is undermined in this film by the spooky kids. I think from a visual standpoint, the image of these town children having a procession with a dead dog in a wheelbarrow wearing animal masks and playing a drum, it's spooky, it's creepy, from that perspective it works.
I love the way that the mom reacts to it too, where and again she brings some of that mundane, that real world perspective into that dark sequence. Is the girl is what is that? And she says, it's a procession. And she's like, what's a procession? She says, it's like a parade, but
for bad things.
But not for fun.
Something like that.
I wanted more innocence out of Ellie, though. I feel like we get that really well in the original.
Really?
In that, she doesn't understand death and why would God take away my pet,
I loved Ellie.
And where in this one, she understood death so easily.
I think the big difference is that they aged her up in this film. They made her a little older. She's 9 in this movie, whereas in the book and the first film, she's 7. She's 6 or 7. She hasn't been exposed to that, and I think that we can use that as a segue into probably the biggest difference of this film from the original is that it is Ellie who gets hit by the truck and not Gage. And so it's Ellie that comes back. And I like certain things about that a lot. I think that they don't fully realize the execution by the end, and they sort of just fall back into spooky, scary kids.
I would agree. I think having a kid that's slightly older gives you a lot more.
Well, because what they do is when they have Ellie come back, she doesn't just go on a killing rampage immediately like Gage does in the book and the original. Is that Ellie comes back, and she is changed, but she's not outwardly violent immediately. She's asking questions to Lewis like, where am I? Am I dead? Stuff like that. We get the great scene of him, like, bathing her and, like, trying to brush the twigs and dirt out of her hair, and the brush keeps getting caught, and he, like, pulls her hair aside, and you see, like, the staples from, like, the suture marks that would be left by the autopsy. I think that stuff is great. And, like, the scene afterwards where he's putting her to bed and she's, like, asking him all of these existential questions and then demands that, like, he lie down with her, and, like, you can see he's visibly uncomfortable lying down next to his, like, zombified daughter. I thought that stuff was great, and I agree that they couldn't have done that stuff with Gage being the one who comes back, with being, like, a toddler. So I understand the need to make it a little bit of an older kid, but I feel like they abandoned so much of that, not long afterwards, that it just left me wanting more of that. Yeah. I would have loved to see more of them, like, Lewis and Rachel, like, trying to reintegrate their zombie child into their family, and things going awry from there. Like, if you're going to make a different interpretation of the story and take it in that direction, I think that would have been super cool.
The problem, though, is, like, the mother would never have been good for it. That's the linchpin, right? Like,
well, right, and we see
mom can't handle death, and so she wouldn't be able to try
and we see some of that, but let us explore that more. Let us have the father keep trying to convince the mother and her just not being about it. Like, let's see some time of them, like, trying to, be a family again, but the mother just can't get past it. And then that leads into, murder and mayhem. But it's like, instead, Rachel comes home, we get the scene where the daughter, where Ellie comes up and Lewis is like, hug your daughter, Rachel. She's like, no, I can't. That's not my daughter. And then it just immediately goes from there into well,
I mean, there's a whole dialogue sequence between the two of them, like, where they back and forth about that, like, where they get ponderous about, like, the nature of, like, Ellie's situation and her state.
Yeah, but it's still, then it's just one scene right before Ellie, starts trying to murder them.
Yeah,
I'm talking about, like, let me see more of that. Let me see some more time, several days, like, let me see Rachel, like, really struggling to try to love her daughter, but not being able to because she knows that it's an abomination. Let me see the same for Lewis. Let me see him trying to really convince her, even though he himself doesn't really believe it, even though he himself acknowledges that this isn't right, but he's lying to himself and to Rachel. Let me see more of that. Let me see that develop. If that's the angle you're gonna take, then develop it. It just feels like they tease it, and then they're just like, oh, well, she's gonna start trying to kill him now.
I agree with you halfway. I think where I fully agree is, I think that would be fascinating to further divulge, like, to see more of those sequences unfold, and to see, like, and to really give us some more of, like, that family conflict.
Right.
I think where it comes into tricky is I'm trying to figure out where in the runtime you could fit it.
Well, that's the thing. You need to either have a longer film, or you would need to have Ellie die sooner and have everything.
The ending is already too quick. The ending is really the only thing I have a problem with.
One of the things I kind of like about them using Ellie instead of Gage as well is how she kind of transforms into both the neighbors and
into Judd's wife. I did like that, and that's where I was like, that's a little bit more of the capturing sort of like the ethos of the villain, of the Wendigo in the book. That's a little bit more what I was looking for, where she, like, her face turns into that of Judd's wife, and she says, we're in hell and we're here to bring you down here with us.
It worked really well for that scene with Judd.
Right.
It didn't work well with the mom. It felt so nihilistic and flat for me with the mother, because in this movie she's less directly to blame for Zelda dying.
No, she's more directly to blame.
Way more.
Because in the original and the book, she just happened to be there as Zelda died. In this one, we had the whole thing with the dumbwaiter where she
takes agency.
She didn't want to go into Zelda's room, so she put the food in the dumbwaiter knowing it didn't work properly, and Zelda tried to get it out of the dumbwaiter and fell in and died.
She knew it didn't always work correctly, but she's not directly at fault.
She's much more so than in the original. In the original, she just walks into the room to feed her, and Zelda dies. And Zelda, has a seizure and dies.
She's just a witness.
She's a witness to it. Whereas in this one, Zelda dies because she falls into the dumbwaiter.
She was told not to use the dumbwaiter, and she used the dumbwaiter.
Right.
And her sister died, consecutively.
And that's one of the things that didn't work for me in this movie was fucking Zelda dying by falling onto the dumbwaiter. I thought that was really stupid.
Yeah, it didn't work at all
really
for me.
Dumb.
And maybe she had more agency, but it still felt really dumb because it's a dumb waiter. But also because
it felt really dumb waiter.
Yeah. Well, just because we get that excellent scene in the original where we see Zelda dying in front of her eyes,
right?
And that is what really
it's better.
affects
I agree.
her,
I agree exactly.
And in this one, we see the steps she takes, but we only see the aftermath, really.
Right, we see her reopening the dumbwaiter.
There's no one-to-one connection in the same way.
No, I agree.
And it kind of strips it of that the horror in that relationship.
I agree 100%.
For me, first off, I think that's legit. I think that those are valid. Taste-wise, I disagree because I liked that Zelda was more of a spectral force that way, and she sort of and it made more sense the way that the nature of the way that she played off and toyed and haunted Rachel was more spectral. We hardly ever see Zelda's face in this adaptation, and that makes Zelda a little bit more of an entity, of a dark being, as opposed to kind of bringing it back to her being a person. She's depersonified and sort of made into this monster.
I liked that stuff. I just didn't like the way that she died in this movie.
Yeah,
I thought that was less effective.
One of my favorite bits.
I think the portrayal of Zelda in this movie is really good because she does seem very monstrous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the makeup effects are really good and really gross.
When they play up that same panning shot where they pan up the bed to her spine, just like in the original.
Yeah.
But in this one, there's so much more grime and filth. It's really, to use the word again, wretched.
Yeah.
But that was great.
I just thought the way she died was really dumb.
So the dumbwaiter, I liked the dumbwaiter as a. I thought it was a cool mechanism. I love the surreal bit where she opens the medicine cabinet and looks up the dumbwaiter and closes it. I thought that was a really fun, what's the word I'm looking for? Not psychedelic, but surreal, yeah, sequence. Thank you. I love that. The person falling down at you out of a dumbwaiter was pretty spooky to me. That I found that scene to be pretty.
Yeah, I think
I did really like how when she first opened it and there was the hole in the wall, you leaned over and whispered "Candyman." That was pretty fun.
It's a very Candyman thing.
I do think that the dumbwaiter stuff makes for some cool visual motifs.
Mm-hmm.
I liked her opening the medicine cabinet and there being the dumbwaiter behind it. Some of her sort of hallucinations, and towards the end where Zelda is crawling out of the dumbwaiter. I think visually it's interesting, but the problem is that it doesn't make that connection thematically the way it's supposed to, because what is part of Rachel's trauma is that she feels responsible for Zelda's death, even though she isn't. She just happened to be a witness to Zelda's death, and yeah, she didn't call for help, but she was in shock. And also, like she said, she prayed for Zelda to die so they could, not have to deal with that horror anymore. So it's like, even though she's not responsible, she's obviously not responsible for Zelda's illness. She's not responsible for Zelda's death. She feels like she is, whereas in the new one, she is responsible for Zelda's death. And I think that is less poignant because her guilt is actually well-founded. I think that her character feeling guilty about something that she's not guilty for is much more interesting than her feeling guilty for something that she absolutely is guilty of. You know what I mean?
There's elements of it that I do like, like having her just hear subconsciously her sister
above her always. Yeah, and she, I like that. I like that
she
stuff
felt like her
too.
sister was always in the walls.
Yeah,
terrifying.
I think that stuff is great, and I think you can still do all of that without her being directly responsible for Zelda's death.
Yeah,
I think that all of that,
Well, it's tricky because I still think that she's not directly responsible, at least to blame. Her parents are still responsible because, again, they left a child to look after her, and of course the child was scared, so she wanted to try and not interact with her directly, so she put it up the dumbwaiter instead.
No, you're right.
The child is not to blame in that scenario.
She is indirectly responsible for Zelda's death. I agree, yeah, okay. It might not be direct. She is indirectly responsible for Zelda's death, but whereas in the original, she has no responsibility. Like, Zelda, she just happens to be a witness to Zelda's death, but feels responsible for it because Zelda made her feel responsible, and I it just doesn't work as well for me in this one that she had any sort of hand in Zelda's death. Whether it obviously wasn't intentional what she did. Like I was saying before, in this film, her guilt is somewhat well-founded, whereas in the original, it's not. She has no reason to feel guilty other than that she's a child and that she, hoped that her monstrous dying sister would finally die so they would be free of that,
I liked it, too, because there's a bit of ambiguity of whether or not Zelda just threw herself down the dumbwaiter. Yeah, she was already, hounding after her and, trying to make her to blame. And she clearly hated her.
Whether she just committed suicide, and threw herself down the dumbwaiter. I suppose that's possible. I didn't really think about that.
The biggest thing that bothered me was the sequence later in the third act when Ellie becomes Zelda and is just talking shit because the themes weren't hit home well enough in the rest of the movie for me with that stuff. It just felt overly nihilistic in that, it doesn't have the same effect of this grief and that stuff that the original had. It just felt like they were intentionally trying to be as cruel to their characters as possible without warranting it with the story.
I don't think I have a problem with Ellie, speaking with the voice of the other dead. When she does it with Norma, with Judd's wife, Norma, I think that works pretty well. And even with her speaking as Zelda, that doesn't bother me too much. My problem is that we get so much of that bullshit, I'm coming to take you to hell, is you're not really my daughter's dead, you're something evil. That's where I was fuck, we know that this is an evil force, acting upon the family, but I don't need that kind of nonsense, and especially then to just have it end the way it does with fucking Ellie dragging Rachel's body out to the burial ground.
Hated that.
And then them killing Lewis and dragging his body out to the burial ground.
Because it totally undermines the themes of the movie, you being forced to keep bringing people back to this ground because you have a way to get a second chance against this grief, but it undermines itself because you have to essentially end up killing those people
allowing them to make the same mistake over and over again, rather than the evil reincarnated zombie child reincarnating the mother, and then the mother and the child reincarnating the father. I think it misses the whole point.
I will say that I had a problem with that. I didn't mind Ellie dragging the mother there so much. I did not like...
What did you see as the reason for that?
The dad part at the end. I didn't necessarily. I was open to it because the whole premise is that like this Wendigo is trying to draw them back to this place, is trying to do that, and so if it has a puppet that is capable of doing that, then it would try to. When it comes to like the motives of the Wendigo, like they remain upright, like for that sequence to happen. When it comes to the dramatic themes of it, like they start to suffer. Now that is, I think, a point of preference. But what I think is less of a point of preference is that the dad also getting killed there, and it ending with zombie family. Also less into that as well.
I mean, like if you want to make an evil Wendigo movie, like do it, make one, but if you're just gonna take all of the plot points and ideas of a high concept idea with a lot of themes like this, like don't undermine it by just being like, oh yeah, evil Wendigos, like,
well, okay, so
it
I'll
undercuts it a lot.
The Wendigo is the high concept.
I don't agree with that at all. I think the high concept is the idea of the burial ground kind of being a vessel.
Well,
which is the Wendigo.
As the only person here who has read the book and knows the source material, I have some thoughts on that. And
go for it.
Yes, the concept is that there is an evil force that compels your grief to overwhelm you and continue making the same mistake over and over again. But that being said, in the same story, the Wendigo is a legitimate antagonistic force. It is a character. However, its goal is not to replicate itself and create a whole zombie family. It is to create suffering, which is why it seeks to reanimate the dead and return to its loved ones to make them suffer, which is what I think the original film does really well. Is it is about causing that suffering to the family and creating the cycle of grief that keeps bringing people back to the burial ground. And to have the undead family members just dragging bodies out to the burial ground, it defeats the purpose of creating that call that draws people into that evil, to be used by that evil. Just bringing corpses out to reanimate them defeats the purpose of that. It's not about the evil needing vessels. It's about the evil wanting to use and torment the living.
And the whole idea there of suffering, I feel like was undercut with the way they did it.
Yes, I agree.
There was no emphasis of suffering.
That being said, well, yes, I do agree with you. That being said,
in that last,
I also think that the Wendigo is underutilized in this movie as well. They directly reference it once in an exposition scene when Judd has like a book, of like that just has like a drawing of a Wendigo. Like that's the only time it's referenced, is like, oh, the woods belong to something else, and they hear some spooky sounds when they're out in the woods. But it's like, if you're going to introduce the idea of the Wendigo, then make it more of like a central thing, like make it that antagonistic force, that is calling people back to the burial ground in order to, use them and consume their souls and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it would have just been a matter of of just having it make some sort of appearance to the father before he was killed, or something.
I would have liked that.
I don't.
And I don't mean like it walking into the set. Like I mean like it being in the background, like you not being able to see it or something, and just its presence.
I actually preferred the way it was used in the original movie, just because by not naming it, it doesn't give us a comfort of knowing what is causing this in the same way. By naming it, you can say, oh, it's just the Wendigo, this is all caused by the Wendigo, whereas in the original it's more esoteric. And I like that.
I don't necessarily agree with that, because naming it doesn't necessarily take mystery or power in the same way that that naming Azathoth allows you to understand Azathoth, Like Lovecraft names his things all the time, but that doesn't make them understandable or comprehensible. So I don't think that giving the antagonist a presence makes it less esoteric.
Yeah, I think
I don't know
Azathoth, is like a giant spectral being.
I think the idea of it is scarier than the naming or the specifics of the antagonist itself in a movie like this.
I'm not saying that I want like to see the Wendigo explicitly.
Like I said, I don't want to walk onto the set.
I think that its presence needs to be felt more. I think in the book you don't really see it. You have a couple of instances where like Lewis gets a sense of it, but it is a force, just like the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. It is an evil entity that is capable of reacting on the world around it. Like in the book, when Rachel is trying to get back to Ludlow from Chicago, like stuff keeps happening to her on the way that is like directly interfering with her getting back. She like falls asleep at the wheel. Her car breaks down for no reason. There is an actual force that is preventing her from getting back and helping, and I think that that's all you need to establish the presence of the evil. And I wish that had been a little bit better done in this movie, in both movies, honestly. Yeah. But in the original, it's just like a few like instances of like the ground rumbling and the tree falling down and that weird face, and that's just like, it's so little. I just wish it wasn't in there. I would much rather it just be totally ambiguous and open to interpretation. But if in this film you're gonna go out of your way to be like
mention it,
like to be like the Wendigo, it's there's the woods belongs to something, it's something evil, then let us feel the presence of that more so.
Maybe they emphasized mentioning that because there's no Indian burial ground in this movie.
Right. Yeah.
A Wendigo is like still part of like Native American myth.
Yeah, no, it is
exactly. The reason I mention that is because since they don't emphasize that it's an Indian burial ground, like they mention it in another way by mentioning the Wendigo.
Well, it's all they say is like, yeah, the local tribes knew that this place was evil, and they fled. Whereas in the original story, it's like this was the Micmac burial ground where they buried their dead, and at some point the ground soured because of the Wendigo, and it started to bring back the dead, but evil, so that's when they abandoned it, but there's not any sort of insistence on that in this movie. It's just like, this spooky place that the Native Americans knew was spooky, so they left. But then to still give it a name, I think it's just it's disjointed. Like, pick one, either go all in or don't. I think that it rides too much of that middle
Yeah,
ground.
like I say, if you want to make a Wendigo movie, make one. Don't go half measure with it.
Right. Well, I'm also, saying, like, if you want to do an adaptation of this film that is a bit of a different interpretation of the original, the source material of the Wendigo is there. You can use, like, that source material is there, and if you want to do an adaptation of the film that hasn't been done before, explore that more. And they just mention it, but then they don't. That's my problem, is if you're not going to explore that idea more, why mention it and why name it?
Yeah,
it's a half measure.
Yeah, I don't see it as much of just being like either make a Wendigo movie or don't. Like, it being periphery is great. Like, it it makes like the ambiguity of it and its shapelessness more horrifying, in the same way that, like, for me, not seeing Zelda's like face as directly like was spookier, to at least get a sense of its presence at the end of the film. That's as far as I'll take that criticism, is just that the film wraps up in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect the Wendigo's, sorry, I bumped the table, that doesn't reflect the Wendigo's like motive, to cause sorrow. And especially knowing that, having that context now. Thank you for bringing that to the table, Tease. Having read the book, again, apologies. I wanted to, but there just wasn't time. But
I mean, it was an extra credit thing for me. I did it because I felt like it. I don't think that, despite constantly referring to the book, I do think that a film based on a book should be able to stand on its own merits, and you shouldn't have to have read the source material to be able to appreciate a film. So I'm not saying that at all.
Totally.
I'm just, having read the source material, I'm using that as a sounding board for what I wish they had done, because they obviously read the source material in order to make the film.
Yes.
All
I mean is that for me it's a personal preference. Like, it's a point where I like to have read the source material if I can't have beforehand.
Totally.
And I lament that I haven't. But
me too, which is why I read the book.
But I do, and I fully agree with that too. Like, I think a film should absolutely be able to stand on its own legs. Speaking of sort of like referencing your source material, I did want to talk about one or two of the times where the film does so. For the most part, in ways that I like, again, except for the ending. First off, there's a great line very early on where the husband says he's very glad to get away from the graveyard shift. I thought that was great, because the graveyard shift is one of Stephen King's like early like best-selling short story novels, and it's them saying like, we're trying to do something a little bit different with this adaptation, and I thought it was both a very reasonable thing for that character to say at that time, so it felt like it fit in the world, and also like some fun commentary.
And when Rachel's sitting in traffic on the way back to the town, she's sitting outside of a sign for Derry, 20 miles, which is the town where it takes place.
Oh, really?
And where several of Stephen King's other stories.
Oh, that's fun.
Derry is a fictional Maine town that is the location of it and a few of his other stories.
See, I like nods like that, because it's less of a hard jab at the viewer to be like, hey, remember this other reference thing or whatever. It's like, you can miss it if you're not familiar with the graveyard shift, or even if you are, like it just breezes by. It feels fitting in the story, like a sign for a town that's set in one of the other places. Like,
right.
It just becomes part of the lore, as opposed to like you feeling like the script writers are trying to like jam a reference down your throat. So I appreciated those subtleties. Another thing I liked a lot was the different way that they played out Judd's death in this. I enjoyed it a lot. Like, in the same way that like a musical cover, it's a tricky line to walk, right? You have to bring your own interpretation to it, but still like hold to like the.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting how they have him go into his bedroom, and you keep seeing the shots from under the bed of his feet, because in the original Gage comes out from under the bed and cuts his Achilles tendon.
Yeah. And we did see that,
so it's that bait and switch,
that Ellie did grab
the scalpel, right? And then to have him like kick the bed aside and she's not under there, and she's under the stairs, so she gets him then.
Yeah, but the cat first like catches
the
his
cat,
eye.
yeah.
And I loved how the cat had more of a direct role in this. Like, the fact that it lures Ellie out into the road.
Yeah.
The fact that like it catches Judd's attention at the top of the stairs, giving Ellie that moment of time. Like, that they're all sort of acting as like puppets for this like horrible creature. I love that. Loved it. Thought it was great.
Yeah, no, I think that stuff is really good too.
Whole dialogue sequence going down the stairs, like, thank you. Give me something like that can be sort of ponderous. Let me think about this stuff. Like, give me some cool lore. Like when she's talking about like how long she's suffered in hell, this idea that even though she was only dead for a couple of days, that she's been like suffering eternally. And that's part of what's made her like so horrid and sort of that sort of made her like a crafted puppet for this personified anguish.
Oh man, I actually didn't like that personally. I think it tells too much to the audience directly, leaves too little to the imagination, and I feel like it's overly nihilistic.
I don't feel like it's literal either. Like this entity is about causing suffering. I think that it's saying whatever that will make him suffer. That's why in the book, like Gage is saying to Judd, like, your wife is getting ass fucked in hell, you know? Like it's just like the most wretched shit you could say. It's trying to cause suffering, and that's why Ellie, you know, takes the face of Judd's wife, you know, when she's saying these things like, there is something beyond death, but it's hell, and Ellie and I are down here, and we're coming to drag you down here too. You know, I don't think that's literal, but it's supposed to. It's about causing horror and suffering, you know.
And I love how Judd denies it, and he goes for his gun again.
Yeah, well, I mean, because he has experience, he knows the power of the place.
He would do that, and it's a fun way.
They don't get into it in this movie, but like in the original and in the book, you know, there is the Timmy Baterman, you know, the kid who got brought back before when Judd was a young man, and like they got a posse together and like went and burned him, you know. And Timmy Baterman is referenced in this film, but as if like those events did happen, but you know, we don't get Judd's flashback perspective. But I think that, you know, you can assume that it probably did happen. So he knows what he's dealing with. So yeah, he denies the evil up till the end.
Yeah, and I liked how the father, what's his name?
Lewis.
I liked a lot how Lewis isn't told that story by Judd. Instead, like, he kind of like flits across it, like when he's like looking through some newspaper articles, like some old, like ones he's trying to figure out like what's the deal with this Pet Sematary, and he, you know, does the usual like Google search. So he doesn't really like have an opportunity to take in that data in the same way, which makes his motive, I think, for bringing Ellie like back to the site so much better. If your buddy, who's the only person who has explained the rules of this place to you, has sat you down and said, hey, every time something's been buried here, it's come back really horrible, right? It makes it, to a degree, like, it also happens in this. Like,
I think it works. I think that works thematically, though, is that there's that irrationality to being told that such and such is bad for you, but your own grief and emotion is unwilling to accept that, and also that there is the sort of hypnotic power of the burial ground, you know, influencing him. You know, it's like if your buddy is in a bad relationship, it's like you can tell your buddy however many times, like, hey, this relationship is bad for you, like, this is toxic, but like they're not going to figure it out themselves until the shit hits the fan, you know. That's kind of how I see it in the original, with Judd telling him like, hey, straight up, this is what happens, and Lewis still being like, but maybe this time it won't be so bad.
Right.
You know?
Well, the denial and the conscious decision, in spite of knowing what's going to happen, to keep doing it makes it all the more tragic, and it emphasizes the themes so much better than just not completely being conscious of that stuff in the same way.
My issue is that in the original, I lost all sympathy for him, like, when he, like, sort of defies, like, all the logic, because everything he understands about this scenario, like, this place, is that everything comes back, is bad, is evil. Whereas there's a little bit of ambiguity left. There's a little bit of a, hey, but maybe not. And that's the difference for me between, like, a friend in a bad relationship and, like, having them figure that on their own, and a friend who's, like, eating glass, you know, like, or just drinking gasoline. It's like, well, that I can't help you with. Like, I lose sympathy at that point, and I lose sympathy for Lewis, like, at that, because there's no way to even attempt to rationalize it. Whereas in this film, like, we see his whole process of trying to rationalize it up until it is his undoing. And that was a little bit more real for me, and I was still able to sit co-pilot with him in the narrative up until then and feel those things myself, as opposed to sort of having to, again, kind of unstrap myself and be like, well, that was, like, I'm not sure if I would, agree with that decision.
In this one, since he's not completely knowing in the same way, it makes him feel more like a victim, and it removes some of his agency in a way. It feels like it's less of his undoing, his own undoing, and more of this evil supernatural entity being the cause of it and outright.
Right. Well, like, the cool thing about it is, like, and it's why I think this movie doesn't just outright do it. Like, everything he still hears is bad about the area, but it's just subdued a little bit. You could still, like, make that point of theme in this context for him still making a bad call with this, like, and it still being something that drives him towards it. Like, that, I think that theme still holds. Because, again, like, he does come across the article about it, he does whatever else like that. It's less heavily handedly, like, thrown at his face. Where in the first film, it's much more like, things are bad here, don't do it. Whereas this, there's just enough, but he still doesn't know. Like, or he still does probably know.
But I think this movie explains it more directly in, like, mentioning the Wendigo and things like that. It's more unclear about the rules behind it. They explain some of the possible causes more directly, where in the original movie, they explain the rules more clearly, but the causes less directly. And I think that works better for me.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely the opposite, I think, for me, because, like, having the rules explained to you and not the cause is problematic, like, from a motive point. But if you have the cause explained but not the rules, you can still play it up. Like, oh, there's something like beyond in this area. Like, the Native Americans referred to it as a Wendigo, but maybe it's something else. Like, yeah, he shows them like a drawing of something, but clearly it's something more than that. And he can say, okay, well, there's something going on here, but what that is, it's not necessarily a Wendigo. It could be something else. It could bring my kid back, but, like, it's still clearly a giant, dark, horrible force. Whereas just saying, hey, we bring things back here and they come back bad. And he's like, oh, cool, I'm going to bring my son here. Whereas, like, in that, he's like, hey, there's still a chance I could do this. And again, it plays into that whole, like, psychosis. And there's a great moment where Judd is, like, rocking back and forth by the fire, like as he's passing out from being drugged, or he's
just immediately. That was a weird scene in my opinion.
Well, there's a cut. I think that there's, like, some time that does pass between the two. And we don't know what he's drugged with.
The scene right before is when his family leaves, and just immediately he goes over to Judd's and.
Well, there's some time that is said to have passed between those.
I mean,
events.
Judd specifically mentions that he saw the family leave earlier that day, so it was like that night.
Yeah, but from the kid's death. Sorry, I thought that's what you were talking about.
No, the quickness that happened did not work for me. And
but
also
the family leaving and him going over to Judd? Because, like, he
and
knew
immediately drugging him, yeah.
Well, because, like, as soon as the daughter died, like, he knew what he needed to do, and he knew Judd wouldn't be okay with it. So, like, no time needed to pass, right? Like, what would time passing serve?
I mean, why even talk to Judd at that point? Like, if you don't mention it and just do it.
Because Judd was always watching. And Judd, he knew that Judd knew that
it just
he was going to go try and do it. So that's why Judd was sitting outside.
Man.
That's the whole reason that Judd was sitting outside, right? Like, is he was, like, kind of keeping an eye out because he didn't want him to go and resurrect his daughter. That's why he drugged him, because he knew that Judd would be a problem.
I think I would have liked to see him agonizing about the decision a little bit more. Just his immediate willingness to do it is a little bit, and then once again, like, that's coming from the book. Like, with the rules being laid out, he knows that what he's doing is not going to work. He knows it's going to end badly, and he rationalizes, and he's like, ah, shit, well, I'm at least going to try it, and then if it doesn't work, well, then I can just, like, kill Gage again and put him back in the cemetery, and no harm, no foul, but at least I got to try, but it's just like, to have him just go do it, just immediately, I think that's a little bit less effective. I don't have a problem with the rules being explained, because I think that his decision to do what he does, even though the rules are so clearly explained, is what makes it interesting.
Yeah, there's that agency.
It's that theme, the soil of a man's heart. Like, he knows that it's not going to end well, and even after he kills Gage, he knows that taking Rachel to the burial ground and burying her isn't going to end well, but he does it anyway. And that's what I think is way more interesting, and I think that this film misses that point, and it does make him be more of like a victim of circumstance, especially when it just ends with zombie family, with the zombies taking them, back.
That's why it feels so nihilistic to me, because it feels like they're all just victims of circumstance rather than being active participants in it. When they're actively doing this in spite of what they have been told will happen, it becomes more tragic because they can't help themselves from doing it. When it's an evil force acting upon them the whole time, they're simply victims.
Personally, I still got that turning point with Lewis where he's had enough realization, or he's had enough information presented to him after Ellie has been brought back that this was a bad call, and he still is in denial about it. He still asks Judd to leave, when Judd comes to ask him, that's after Ellie has thrown a bunch of shit on the ground and is kind of started to make it very apparent that she's a demon.
He thinks he can fix it.
Right.
He was saying earlier, we don't get enough of him trying to fix it, trying to assimilate her back. They abandoned that, and because of that...
But we still got more of it than in the original.
Well, yeah, because they're taking a different approach, and not just having the child come back and immediately start killing. They're introducing a different approach that they don't follow through on.
And I think if they had done that, it would have given some agency and some tragedy to that, because, it is them actively working in spite of knowing, the rules of this are pretty clear at that point. Whereas, as it is now, he does have that moment of somewhat regret after the fact, but the action of doing it, there was no, second guessing, really. He just did it.
I think there's still a great deal of second guessing, because again, like I said, still all the information that's presented to him is this is a malevolent place, and this is probably a bad idea.
But the rules aren't clear. He doesn't understand that it's a malevolent place in the same way.
I think he does. He goes there, and there's the place is entirely terrifying. There's the lightning in the sky, and again, the Wendigo is played up to him. The information that is presented to him is exclusively bad.
But even as you were saying, we understand that the Wendigo might be at play, but we don't know what that means. Mm-hmm. He doesn't know what that means, so
he knows that it's bad, though. He does know that.
He doesn't necessarily know that going up there is...
He's told that it's bad, but he doesn't have any reason to really believe it. The cat comes back, and the cat's kind of a shit, but other than that, he just knows that it brings back the dead, and it might be a spooky place, but he's a doctor. He's a rational thinker, so it makes sense for him to try to explain the badness away, whereas in the original story, he can't really do that. There's no way to rationalize it. His rationalization is inherently irrational, but he's being drawn there, by a supernatural force. And I just think that that's not addressed as intelligently in this new movie.
I just think that the concept of reanimating your own child is enough. I think that's enough to be terrifying, it was for me.
Yeah, sure, it is, but who alive doesn't wish that when one of their loved ones dies that they could bring them back? I think it's...
But in what state? And that...
Well, right.
And that is made clear to him with the cat.
That is the horror of this, is that is that you can bring them back, but exactly in what state. But I mean, a cat is also not a person, you know. The cat
So,
comes
man,
back
sorry,
and it's got a bad attitude, you know, but I don't think he really understands like the ramifications of burying a person up there, and to not get any of that, I don't think it makes his decision to do so as horrifying as when he's told explicitly,
or tragic,
like, or tragic,
you know? Yeah.
when he's
It's
told
less relatable,
as
though, for me.
explicitly, like, this is what happens if you bury a person up here. This is what will happen. It's been done before, and this is how it ended. And for him to be like, that does sound shitty, but maybe it'll be different with my kid, you know?
You know, and he's blinded by grief, you know, like, obviously you're gonna do that in spite of knowing what happens, and that's what makes it tragic, because he's so blinded by his grief, and suffering.
I think that in this version, if he had been aware in the same way, fully of the rules, and he had taken Ellie back up there, that the sequences after with Ellie that we did like, that we want more of, like, wouldn't have been as effective, because we can't relate with him as directly. I wouldn't be able to put myself in his position as easily. I wouldn't be able to sit co-pilot with him again if he'd made like those irrational decisions. I would have found that less effective, I think, as I found it less effective in the original film. No, y'all didn't. Y'all found it more effective because of it being an irrational decision, and I think that's where our point of taste differ. And I think both are valid.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think that we're starting to go in circles a little bit.
The last thing I want to talk about,
okay,
unless there's something else you wanted to cover, is the very ending with Gage in the car.
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to say, like, I really disliked how that ended with, the 3 zombie family members coming up to the car and it just ending, especially when the first shot of the movie is like the empty car and just the bloody house. I feel like it's so unnecessarily nihilistic and cruel and doesn't do anything for the themes or ideas of the movie. It's just to punish this kid.
I think that it thematically misses the point, and that's why I don't like it. I like the last shot, like where the family is walking towards the car and the cat jumps up on the hood and like looks in at the kid and is like licking its chops. I like that shot visually. I think it's striking. Thematically, the zombie family thing just like totally misses the point of the film, and I think it's a dumb, bad ending. So I'll agree with you there 100%.
It really is like the last like 2 minutes of the film. The dad dies and the family goes up, and I agree, did not like it. Looked great, like you were saying. Cinematography is excellent, like in that sequence. But no, I agree, and I do feel it did largely sort of miss the point, and it didn't carry it all the way home with that last part. I think that slinging a baby doll around in a fight scene is worse, but I do think that this scene is that sequence is not great, and it is by far the worst thing about this film. You mentioned that you'd preferred Ellie, I think, in the previous film. I loved Ellie in this movie. I
thought this actor was much better in this film.
I thought she was great, and her another cool point that immediately won me over with her was when she's the one who notices that Pet Sematary is misspelled. I thought that was quite fun, and then from there on out, like, she continues to talk like a person does. Her dialogue is very believable, like, for a kid that age. There's several interactions with her and her dad at the beginning that are very legitimately heartwarming, and considering that I knew the direction the film was taking, and it still kind of like stopped and made me like, oh, that's really sweet. Like, that's a really nice moment. Like, was, I think, a testament to like how well they set that up at the beginning.
I mean, the problem I had with it was because they set her as a slightly older character, there wasn't as much naivete to her character. And therefore, because of that, the innocence wasn't quite there in the same way. It was still heartwarming and she was still a good actress. But as a whole, it doesn't have that same weight in a lot of ways for me.
Interesting, because like, how old was she? Like
9.
9? I think we got
she dies on her
innocent.
9th birthday.
Yeah, I think like that's still like supremely innocent.
But like the ideas of not knowing how death works and stuff like that is what I meant by that. Okay. Like, it's that naivete It's not understanding all of that stuff, and having to have it explained in such a way. And they do an explanation scene in this movie, but it doesn't work in the same way for me.
Really?
Because it feels like she understands it more easily.
Well, because like she's already aware of like you're saying, like she's already aware of death.
Exactly, exactly.
But also like that's because she's not just being used as a mechanism. Whereas in the first film, that's all her character is. She's a reason for them to talk about death, and then she goes away. Whereas in this movie, like, I mean, she's so much more than that. And in that sequence, like, her purpose is to serve something different. And it still spikes that conversation of death and about suffering. And it becomes more about suffering than it is just death itself, which, again, is, I think, even more inclined towards the...
Yeah, I think it would have worked better if she was more naive about that stuff, though. If they had emphasized the naivete and the innocence in her youth and not understanding the world in the same way, it would have made that stuff hit home for me more.
Interesting. I think that age is such a hard time because like you're beginning to understand it but don't have all the pieces, which is what that conversation was. And I think that is for me more impactful because you have like, as opposed to just being like, what death, it's a little bit deeper than that. It's actually getting into the nuances of death and what happens after death. And she's able to have something a little bit more philosophical of a conversation with her parents that spurns a more philosophical conversation between just the two of them, as opposed to just what is death and that being the conversation. I think it's a little bit deeper. Like it's a little bit, they can discuss more things and they can get into the root of suffering a little bit better.
I guess, yeah. I don't want to dismiss what you're saying because I can totally understand where you're coming from. I don't want to make it seem like I was dismissing you there. I can see where you're coming from there.
And I can see where you're coming from there too. Like a child that does not even comprehend death, sort of being brought into that environment and becomes an agent of it is fucking terrifying. Like, you're right. Also, like, I agree with that. And again, that's why I specify with for me.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem with, or maybe not necessarily the problem, but part of the challenge when you're making Ellie be the one who dies and comes back rather than Gage, because Gage is like a toddler. He's truly innocent. He has no concept of death whatsoever, where Ellie is starting to have to understand death. And in this movie, like, she has an idea of death. She has encountered death before, but she doesn't she still has questions about what happens afterwards, and then she experiences that firsthand as the one who dies. So I think it's kind of inherent to remove some of her naivete in order to have her play the role that they need her to in this film. And I think that opens the door for some really interesting concepts that they start to hint at.
But they don't explore.
But then the problem is that they abandon at the end for zombie family slasher movie.
I actually agree. I think
the movie ends.
I absolutely agree. I think if they would have explored that more, I would have been way more forgiving of her being less naive as a character.
I think I can agree with that.
The thing is, because they don't do that enough, it leaves me feeling flat about it.
Yeah, I think
there's not that emotional weight in the same way.
Yeah, I think it's just zombie family.
Yeah, it damages so much of the good parts of the film for me. I'm gonna go ahead and rate because I think we've come full circle. Honestly, I think that this film does well the things that I didn't like about the original, i.e. tone and acting, but the problem is that it doesn't do well the things that I liked about the original, which is like themes and bigger picture and concept. I think that is where it's wanting. So it's weird. It's like the reverse of the original, where like it fixes problems that I had with the original, but then creates new problems that the original does properly. I think that the acting is so much better across the board in this movie. Largely, a lot of the dialogue is better written. I think that it does away with a lot of the hokiness and has a more darker, serious tone that matches the book more. But it's just like, man, it really misses a lot of the really important themes that I think make the Pet Sematary story so good. That being said, I don't think this film is boring. Like, I had some problems, and there are some things that made me groan, especially at the end, but I was fairly well entertained, through the entire time that I was watching the movie, It wasn't a slog. So I think that ultimately I got a positive impression from this movie. It just left me wanting, but in different ways than the original left me wanting. I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. I think that it's a solid film, but it fixed problems and then created new ones, and I think that is really frustrating.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely mirror that. The acting in this movie is just miles better.
And the characters, I think, are better because of it.
And I would agree. And the biggest issue I have with this movie is because they miss the point of the concepts and themes. It feels more like a hollow remake of the events of the first movie than it feels like an adaptation of the source material. It feels like it just imitates a lot of times more than it tries to convey ideas for me. And I think it feels really hollow because of that. Additionally, it feels very nihilistic and meaningless and flat because of that. I really had a problem with the whole third act in particular. The movie worked better in the first 2 acts before that for me. It wasn't perfect. Some of the things like the Pascal stuff didn't work quite as well, and I wish they had more dynamism in the setting and tone of the movie, so when the dark moments happen, they feel, more contrasted to everything else and feel more emphasized in their darkness. Honestly, at times this movie just felt like a haunted house, insidious version of the events of Pet Sematary more than it felt like a true adaptation of the concept that they were going for, especially with the Stephen King material. So I was kind of disappointed with it. It still has awesome effects, awesome acting, but I was underwhelmed. So I'm going to give it a 2.5 out of 5.
I enjoyed this movie. It's hard to say front to back. Again, the thing, the one thing that really did it for me was the last 2 minutes. The dad dying in Zombie Family. Like the last sequence was really the only thing that I personally had a problem with. The rest of the film, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Also, another thing I didn't mention too is I loved the sound design, and the scoring was awesome. There's a really cool sequence where he's like, I think it's when he's digging up his daughter. Like, there's a really cool like bass line. Anyway, point is, the acting's incredible. It's character driven. I enjoyed that. For me, it was pretty fucking awesome, except for missing that last step at the very end. And I think that's the only thing that misses the themes. I think the rest of the film hits the themes quite well, personally. I'm gonna give it a 4 because I thought it was fan-fucking-tastic except for that last part. And so keeping it from being a 5. So that's my part.
Well, funnily enough, that still averages out to exactly the same as the original. 3.3 out of 5 pods for the remake of Pet Sematary. If you haven't seen the movie, go check it out. Let us know what you think. Hit us up on Twitter at PodPeoplePod and give us your thoughts. Which one do you like better? Which one works better thematically? Engage with us.
We did bet on this movie.
We did.
Emphasize. I'll start with the box office for opening weekend. Tease, you predicted 40 mil opening weekend box office. Cleveland, you predicted 50 mil, and I said 38 mil. The true answer was 24.5 mil.
Wow, small.
So,
well, God, we all overshot, but you're closest.
Yep, I won that. And for the Rotten Tomatoes, Tease, you said 70. Cleveland, you said 85. And I said 66. Funny enough, that kind of mirrors our actual opinions on this movie. The current Rotten Tomatoes score is 58.
All right, well, you got that one too.
So I was closest
with
both of them there.
Next week, we're bringing one out of the vault. It's an episode on the new guest or the recent Gaspar Noé film, Climax, that Ben and I went and saw, and we recorded an episode on this a few weeks ago. So y'all are going to be getting that next week. It's a little bit shorter, more casual episode with just me and Ben. And after that, the week after, we're probably going to be doing Hellboy, the new Hellboy, potentially the originals as well. So yeah, follow us for that. Keep your eyes peeled. Like I mentioned before, follow us on social media at Pod People Pod on Twitter, letterboxd.com/podpeoplepod for the list of all the films we've talked about on the show, our ratings, links to those reviews, shit like that. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome.
And I'm at Mr. Sheets.
And I'm tweeting for at Light Arc Studio for It Stares Back stuff.
Yeah, by the time this episode comes out, our Discord should be live, and there should be a link to play our alpha of the prologue for It Stares Back.
Yeah.
So yeah, follow us on Twitter. If you are interested in playing the game, you should be able to do so by checking us out on Twitter. And there will be a link to the Discord from there. So yeah, do the thing. And you can finally see what we've been working on and plugging for all of these months. So that's very exciting.
Super fucking exciting.
Where can they find your art, Cleveland?
You can find that shit on ArtStation. Type in something along the lines of ArtStation, either Iron Prism or Cleveland Mosier, which is me. You know how it is.
Yeah. Check out that spooky, scary art. Yeah. It's good shit.
And some not spooky, scary art, with American Fugitive and all the rest of it.
Oh, yes. Also so that.
I got it for everybody, man. We got art for days. Bring it on.
True story.
Go check it out.
All right. Well, thank you as always for listening. Tune in next week for mine and Ben's thoughts on Climax.
And I will be spookily listening in the corner. I won't be there, but I will be
He'll be
there.
He'll be the Pascal of the episode.
You'll be there in spirit. All right. Well, until next time, clean the dirt out of your hair. Bye.